The capacity to exercise moral autonomy, the capacity to refuse to cooperate, offers us the only route left to personal freedom and a life with meaning. Rebellion is its own justification, and those of us who come out of the religious left have no quarrel with Camus. Camus is right about the absurdity of existence, right about finding worth in acts of rebellion rather than some bizarre dream of an afterlife or Sunday school fantasy that God rewards the just and the good. O my soul, the ancient Greek poet Pindar wrote, do not aspire to immortal life, but exhaust the limits of the possible. We differ with Camus only in that we have faith that rebellion is not ultimately meaningless. Rebellion allows us to be free and independent human beings, but rebellion also, I believe, chips away, however imperceptibly, at the edifice of the oppressor and sustains the dim flames of hope, empathy, justice, and love. And in moments of profound human despair, these flames are never insignificant. They keep alive the capacity to be human. We must become, as Camus said, so absolutely free that existence is an act of rebellion. And those who do not rebel in our age of totalitarian capitalism, those who convince themselves that there is no alternative to collaboration, commit spiritual and moral suicide. Alexander Herzen, speaking a century ago to a group of anarchists about how to overthrow the Tsar, reminded his listeners that it was not their job to save a dying system, but to replace it. We think we are the doctors, he said. We are the disease. All resistance must recognize that the body politic and global capitalism are dying, and we should stop wasting energy trying to reform or appeal to it. This does not mean the end of resistance, but it does mean very different forms of resistance. It means turning our energies towards building sustainable communities to weather the coming crisis, since we will be unable to survive and resist without a cooperative effort. It means acceptance that this struggle for justice will outlive us, that every value we fight for may be diminished when our own lives draw to a close, but external reality cannot be the yardstick for how we measure the moral life. Our mediocre and bankrupt elite is desperately trying to save a system that cannot be saved, and more importantly, they are trying to save themselves. All attempts to work within this decayed system and this class of power brokers will prove useless, and resistance must respond to the harsh new reality of a global capitalist order that will cling to power through ever-mounting forms of brutal and overt repression. Once credit dries up for the average citizen, once massive joblessness creates a permanent and enraged underclass, and the cheap manufactured goods that are the opiates of our commodity culture vanish, we will evolve, I expect, into a system that more closely resembles classical totalitarianism. Cruder, more violent forms of repression will have to be employed as the softer mechanisms of control favored by what the philosopher Sheldon Wolin calls our system of inverted totalitarianism break down. We cannot allow ourselves to surrender to the dehumanizing ideology of totalitarian capitalism. Acts of resistance which keep alive another narrative empower others who we may never meet to stand up and carry the flame. we pass to them. And I know of what I speak. It was my father's life of defiance, his fight as a Presbyterian minister for racial equality, against war, and finally his outspoken defense of gay rights, positions that sabotaged his own career and drove him out of pulpit after pulpit that set every single standard by which I measure my own life. It is my voice tonight that you hear, but these are his words. And in the Christian faith, we call this resurrection. Thank you.
Chris, a number of questions here. For starters, a lot of people are reacting to the fact that you've laid out many of the problems facing us. You've certainly addressed it partly in tonight's talk, but a number of people are wondering about how to fight back. One person writes, a significant limitation of the left in the United States is that we're fragmented and mostly ineffective. Someone else, Carlos, writes, I'm appalled at the lack of information and organization of the American people. Questions, what do you propose as the best strategies to, number one, spread the word as to progressive ideas and analysis? And number two, how should people organize? Should they start a progressive challenge within the Democratic Party, or should they start an independent progressive challenge with the danger of splitting the Democratic vote?
I had lunch last week in New York with Father Daniel Berrigan, who will turn 90 in a few days. I saw him because I brought in our newest child, 3 months old daughter, and he baptized her and held her in his arms and talked about Selma and a life of commitment. And as Berrigan says, quoting his brother Phil, if voting was that effective, it'd be illegal. All of the true correctives to American democracy never achieved formal power, ever. The Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists, the labor movement, the civil rights movement. They understood that, as Karl Popper wrote, the question is not how do you get good people to rule? That's the wrong question. Most people attracted to power, as Popper points out, are at best mediocre, which is Obama, or venal, which is Bush. The question is, how do you make the elite frightened of you? The last liberal president we had in this country was Richard Nixon, because we had movements that scared the crap out of them. And so we got OSHA and the Mine and Safety Act, Clean Water Act. It's not our job to take power. We must serve the principles of truth and justice, just as those who strive after power seek privilege and power. And the closer or the more we compromise with those whose goal is privilege and power, the more we diminish the capacity for truth and justice. The most powerful figure in the United States, at least until April of 1968, was Dr. Martin Luther King, because when he went to Memphis, 50,000 people went with him. We have been ruthlessly stripped of the capacity to make the needs and rights, especially of our poor, of working men and women, heard. Our media has been dominated, controlled by roughly a half dozen corporations: Viacom, General Electric, which didn't pay any taxes again this year, Disney, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, and shut out the voices of those or suffering in this permanent underclass that we have created. And it's incumbent upon us who care about change to recognize that the rage and anger of our underclass is a legitimate rage and begin to express that rage as our own, because if we do not, it will be co-opted by these proto-fascist movements such as the Tea Party and others who will channel that anger and hatred as totalitarian systems do to scapegoats, to Muslims, to gays, to undocumented workers. They speak in the language of violence, they celebrate the gun culture, and it is incumbent upon those of us who care about our civil society to carry out acts of civil disobedience, because we are the last thin line of defense between that civil society and its destruction.
Well, riffing off of that theme, one questioner wants to know if you can direct us to activism that's taking on the corporations that manufacture weapons and sell them to countries around the world.
There's always something happening. I was just in New York, in Union Square, where we occupied Bank of America, which hasn't paid taxes for the last 3 years, although they've consumed $45 billion in taxpayer subsidies. And I think that we have to get over the preoccupation with numbers. I've been protesting outside of the White House with Veterans for Peace and Iraq veterans against the war, and these protests have in some way to become ends in and of themselves. When we protested in December, it was very heavy snowfall in Lafayette Park, and at the end of the rally, a great blues musician, Watermelon Slim, got up and played taps on his harmonica. Several veterans folded the flag of a young man who had been killed a week or two before in Afghanistan. Everyone was silent. Many of us have spent far too long in the midst of war and carry that trauma with us. There were veterans, often in their uniform, bearing tremendous emotional and physical scars. Someone beat a drum, no one spoke. And we marched in single file to the fence of the White House, and I'll be honest with you, many of us were crying. And we stood on the fence until 131 of us were arrested. And when the Washington, D.C. police put the plastic cuffs on us, on our hands behind our back, it turned out that many of them had spent time in Iraq and Afghanistan, and as they walked us over to the vans to take us to the holding tank and the cell, they would say, "Keep doing what you're doing, because these wars stink." That's my church, and those are the people I worship with.
Well, our next question is a very interesting one about a lesser-known philosopher who essentially wrote the handbook on nonviolent direct action for a new generation of activists. This questioner asks, would you speak to the hopeful work of Gene Sharp and his influence on the nonviolent revolutions that have happened, although are incomplete, in Tunisia and Egypt and beyond?
Yeah, Gene Sharp is great, and I'm a huge admirer of Gene Sharp. I understand the poison of violence. I also understand how human beings can be pushed so far that they face a choice between extinction, as of course Native Americans did, and the employment of violence in a desperate act of self-preservation. I was in Sarajevo during the war, and it was very clear to those of us who were in the besieged city that if the Serbs broke through the barricades around the city. We had trench systems around Sarajevo. If they broke through those barricades, a third of the city, as happened in the Drina Valley, would be murdered, and the other 2/3 would be driven into displacement or refugee camps. But once you employ violence, it is always tragic. And that is why, of course, the criminal class and the gangsters organized the initial defenses of the city. And when they weren't shooting at Serbs, they were raiding the apartments of ethnic Serbs who had remained behind, looting them and often executing them. So there are moments. I covered the war in El Salvador for 5 years. That's another example. Series of peaceful protests. Salvadoran Treasury Police opened fire with machine guns on protesters, gave birth to a rebel movement. And I think civil disobedience, for those of us who care about nonviolence, becomes almost urgent at this point, because we are seeing the backlash against the power structures being expressed and articulated by a movement that celebrates violence. And if we don't succeed in building an effective resistance around core moral values, then the resistance will be expressed through a lunatic fringe of our political establishment.
Well, Chris, you have a bit of a fan club here. One person says, why don't you start an organization? You'd have many instant members. Someone else writes very simply, why are you being allowed to do this? In the spirit of that question, though, you were at the New York Times for many years. Was it 2 decades?
15 years.
15 years. How did you go from that establishment paper of record to this other world that you occupy now, truthdig.com? How did you make that transition, and how has that affected your ability to reach people?
Well, it was pretty easy. They asked me to go. I gave a commencement address. I was very outspoken against the whole argument to invade Iraq, a country I know very well. The Middle East is a region I know very well. The instrument of war I know very well, and was consciously committed career suicide. But the final sort of culmination was a commencement address I gave in Rockford, Illinois at Rockford College in May of 2003, in which I denounced the war, and I had my microphone cut twice and was booed and jeered. It's all on YouTube. And at one point, the crowd got up and began singing "God Bless America." My wife's an actor, and Michael Moore watched the YouTube and called me up and said, no, I think you're the really great actor in the family, just to be able to keep giving a commencement address. And at the end, 2 young men climbed up on the podium to try and push me aside. So I'm trying to give my talk while campus security is trying to push these guys back down into their seats. And they decide to escort me off the podium before the awarding of diplomas. They don't want the students to come in contact with me. And I had an academic robe, and I said, but my jacket, it's in the president's office. They said, we'll mail you your jacket. And they drove me to my hotel and watched as I packed my bag and put me on a bus to Chicago. And the next day, the Rockford Star ran a headline that said, Rockford College graduation speaker disrupts commencement. And of course, Fox and all the trash talk shows got a hold of the home movie footage and began running it in loops. And so they forced the Times to respond, and the Times called me in because we were Guild and issued me a formal written reprimand for impugning the impartiality of the New York Times. And that's the process by which you give an employee a formal written warning, and then the next time the employee violates that warning, you have grounds to fire them. So I knew at that moment that I had a choice. I could pay fealty to my career, but to do so would be to betray my dad. And I couldn't do that. And I quit. And when I walked out of that building, I realized, or I articulated for the first time, that the greatest gift my father had given me was freedom.